part of the TrustMatters webinar series hosted by Trusted Advisor Associates and the Get Real Project. Charles H. Green, the CEO of Trusted Advisor Associates, is hosting. The webinar's focus is creating a trust-based organization, 5 ways to improve culture. If you have questions throughout the webinar, you can use the chat feature on the bottom. Simply, you can message everybody or message myself, Jason Gluskin, and we'll answer your questions. Sometimes we're going to pause throughout the webinar. We're also going to have a few minutes at the end to answer questions. So that's pretty much it. I'm going to give it over to Charlie, and I think we can start up pretty soon.
Okay, let's kick it off. Hello, everybody. I'm Charlie Green. As Jason said, founder and CEO of Trusted Advisor Associates. Welcome to the 5th in this ongoing series. Today, we're going to talk about trust-based organization. That's a little bit different than some of the other subjects we've been talking about. If you've been with us on the series, we talked about the trust equation, recovering lost trust, getting advice taken, etc. Today, as I said, creating the trust-based organization. And just a little look forward, next year, networking like a trusted advisor, why closing is hazardous to your sales health, and stay tuned, there will be more subjects as well. But let's dive into this one. Usually we refer to a lot of information from the book, The Trusted Advisor. Today we're going to go a little bit differently. We're going to focus on a book that Andrea Howe, my partner and co-author, wrote, The Trusted Advisor Field Book. Because again, we're going to deal more with issues of trust in organizations. So, the presenting question is, so you'd like to build trust in your team or your organization? Here's a pet peeve of mine. I've noticed that 90% of what's out there, 90% of what's out there, 90% of what's out there talking about trust is people arguing why trust is a good thing. And my feeling is, duh, we all kind of get that. I think we've been beaten to death with how trust is great, how trust improves teamwork, profitability, et cetera, et cetera. The real question, which I don't find dealt with very much, is how do you do it? How do you increase trust in your team or your organization? And that's what we're going to focus on today. So let's dive into it. Let me start with a couple of key concepts. In chapter 1 of the field book, Andrea and I wrote that there are 3 kind of key concepts underlying trust. And to reiterate them, trust is personal, meaning the most powerful and important source of trust is personal, not institutional. That it's paradoxical, that it's loaded with instances of where what you think is the obvious thing to do is not the obvious thing to do. And the non-obvious thing ends up being very relevant to trust. And the third one is it's positively correlated to risk. It's tempting to think that trust is a risk-lowering thing. In a weird sense it is, but trust doesn't get created unless somebody takes a risk. So we're going to come back to those points, but in particular, I want to emphasize this one. Trust is essentially a personal relationship. Again, I'm not saying it's not meaningful that you can say things like, I trust Amazon, I trust Apple, I trust my company. But more importantly, the deeper, stronger form of trust is interpersonal between 2 human beings. Now, fancy phrase here, personal trust is bilateral and asynchronous. Let me simplify that complicated statement. What I mean is that when trust happens, it's because there's an interaction between 2 parties, one of whom is trustworthy, and that person interacts with somebody who is willing to be trusting. And the result, when that happens, what you get is trust. And if all we do is talk about trust, the bottom line there, we ignore the dynamics of it, the way you create it, which is an interaction between trustworthiness and trusting. And by the way, as regards chicken egg, you can't get by with just doing one. A lot of times it's tempting to think about just being trustworthy, but if you're not willing to trust also, it turns out it won't work. Trust has to go back and forth and interact. So let's dive in here. Let me suggest, just given what we've said already, trust is personal, that the challenge is not to create an organization that people trust, which is how it's usually phrased. The challenge instead is to create an organization in which people trust and are trusted. That's the significance of saying trust is personal. So when you think about that, if the issue is how do we create trust in an organization, here's how typical change initiatives are approached for classical change management. And I'm going to grossly overgeneralize here, but I think most of you would agree. Where does it start? It starts at the CEO office. If you want to see change, it has to start from the CEO level on down. Where do most change management initiatives focus? They focus on process, structure, roles. How about in people? It's usually defined as behaviors and skills. Those of you in the audience in the HR leadership function, you know the language for training programs. People will learn the skills associated with and so forth. Another assumption, who spreads it? It's organizational leaders who spread it according to the classic model of change initiatives. How does it spread? Systematically, through the system, via directives. How is it implemented? Through chain of command and through followers. Again, this is sort of a caricature of a classic change management initiative. What motivates people? Well, largely incentives. This is the model. We look at how we hire people, how we promote people, how we pay people, how we give out attaboys, basically incentives. And how is it measured, finally? You're all familiar with the phrase, you can't measure it if you can't manage it. I disagree with that phrase. But those are, I think, not too crudely put, a number of change management assumptions. Now, there's some hidden assumptions in viewing the world that way, and let's just unpeel them a little bit. Number one, people are largely rational and cognitive. That's an underlying assumption. We all know they're not totally, but that's the basic assumption behind most change management initiatives. At the end of the day, behaviors are what matter. Behaviors are what we measure. Behaviors are the only outcomes, trackable, et cetera, et cetera. Another assumption, people are assumed to behave in enlightened self-interest maximizing ways. Rational self-maximizers, you've all heard that phrase. If you want to unleash change in an organization, appeal to what's in it for me. And finally, the assumption that people respond to power dynamics and authority. Well, those are more or less true, usually, for the most part. But when it comes to trust, things are a little bit different. Even just given what we've said already, trust is this interaction between people. The most powerful form of trust is personal, not institutional. I trust Amazon to deliver my packages. I don't trust Amazon to babysit my granddaughter for me. It depends on who I'm talking to from Amazon. Second, trust is at its essence. It is essentially a relationship. It's not an individual phenomenon. There's no trust if there aren't two people. There's nothing to trust. So trust also has both rational and emotional components. Sure, enlightened self-interest is part of it, logical, deductive behavior, credentials, expertise, but also intimacy, connection, vulnerability, these kinds of issues that are profoundly emotional are part of trust. And finally, power and authority are fairly weak forms of incentives when it comes to trust. We don't trust other people because somebody tells us to. We don't trust individuals because they say, trust me. So, and finally, trust is a mixture of self-interest and other interest. All classical definitions of trust, because it's a relationship, have some component of benevolence, wanting to do well, help other people. Again, trust is a relationship. So I'd argue if you're going to have a trust change program, if you want to do something to increase trust in an organization, it's got to reflect some of these differences. So in particular, and I'm going to restate this a little more strongly, people trust people, not organizations. And so the challenge is not to create an organization that's trusted, because we don't trust organizations as much as people, is to create a trust-based organization. And what I mean by that, an organization in which people behave in trusting and in trustworthy manners with regard to all stakeholders at all times. That's
hey, Charlie, we have a question already related to this that Good. I think is appropriate time. So Howie asked if trust starts with leadership and senior executives. How can it happen within an organization when the CEO isn't trustworthy or trusting?
Well, thank you for raising that. I want to emphasize that point. Trust happens between people, and it happens in moments. It happens in interactions. No CEO can totally control how you interact with another human being. We as individuals have a tremendous amount of agency when it comes to trust, even in the strictest hierarchical organizations. There are moments when you connect with another person. And it helps to have a CEO that is trustworthy and role modeling, no question about it. But it's not like other change initiatives. There's a tremendous amount of agency for us to interact and behave on our own with other people. So does it make a difference? Yeah. Is it a killer? Nope, I don't think so. I think we all have a lot of ability to create, trust in our own interactions, regardless of what the CEO is saying. Hope that's a partially responsive answer. So how do you do it? I'm going to suggest you do it through virtues and values. I'll define what that means, but very quickly. Virtues are personal virtues, just what the word says. Virtuous things that we think about others and ourselves. And values, you know this word, the traditional sense of organizationally closely held values. So what are those? Let me suggest those of you that have been with us on previous things, a good indicator, a good example of trust virtues are the trust equation. Again, many of you know this. It's a model for trustworthiness, attributes of a trustworthy person. A trustworthy person is virtuous with respect to credibility, i.e. they say the truth. They're smart, they're capable, they're competent. A trustworthy person is virtuous with respect to reliability. You can depend on what they say, they execute, they deliver on their promises, they have high integrity. A trustworthy, virtuous person is capable of intimacy, which we define as a sense of security. I feel safe interacting with this person. They're not going to abuse my confidence. They're not going to take advantage of me. They're going to treat me with care and respect. And finally, in the denominator, meaning it goes the other way, self-orientation. High self-orientation is anti-virtuous. It's a vice. It's being self-preoccupied, which takes us away from being able to connect with other people. Now, among those virtues, you might say, by the way, the first two, credibility and reliability, kind of belong in that rational realm that we talked about. The other two, intimacy and self-orientation, low self-orientation being good, those kind of fall in the emotional realm. So trustworthiness and the virtues of trustworthiness are part rational and part emotional. So that's on the personal side. Now, on the values side, we suggest, and Andrew and I wrote about this in the Trusted Advisor Field book. In fact, I wrote about it earlier in the book Trust-Based Selling. 4 principles that should act as touchstones, guideposts to trust-creating behavior. And they're fairly simple, and I'm not going to preach that these are the only set of principles, but they work pretty well. Feel free to come up with your own, but these 4 that we've come up with are, number 1, a focus on the other for the sake of the other. Client focus for the sake of the client, not for the sake of our own bottom line. A genuine focus on the other person without regard to what it means for us. Second, a collaborative approach to relationships, meaning mentally we are always on the same side of the table as the other party, as the client, as the customer, whatever. Third, a medium to long-term relationship perspective, not a transactional focus. If you focus on transactions all the time, you'll kill off a relationship. Whereas if you focus on relationships over time, like a tree produces fruit, you're going to create a lot of transactions along the way. And finally, a habit of being transparent in all of your dealings. 2 exceptions. Number 1, when it's illegal. There are legal laws covering, intellectual property, patent rights, confidentiality, that sort of thing. Or number 2, where it's unnecessarily hurtful and harmful. Brutal trust or brutal candor is not a virtue. So those 4 trust principles, again, come up with your own, but these work pretty well. And if we use these as touchstones, as indicator, take seriously the values, they turn out to be guideposts for all kinds of conundrums that show up in the day-to-day business world. So let's take those 2 approaches and put them back into the typical change management perspective. If you want to create a trust-based organization, I think some of the change initiatives are going to look a little bit different. Where does it start? Anywhere. Now, again, to the previous question, does it help if the CEO leads? Yes, it does. Is it harder if the CEO is antitrust? Yes, it is. But I would argue we still have a tremendous amount of agency at the personal, interpersonal level to begin to gravitate out from our own locus in the organization. Where's the focus? Instead of process structures and roles, we focus on virtues and values. What's the change in people? It's not just behaviors, it's also mindsets, attitudes, belief systems. Because it's also true that most of our behaviors come from particular beliefs or mindsets. It's not always act your way into right thinking. Sometimes it's think your way into right acting as well. Who spreads it? Organization leaders? Well, not just the typical leaders. When it comes to trust, informal leaders also, people who carry a lot of influence, who carry a lot of sway with others. You all know people like this. You've seen network maps of people who have a lot of influence. Doesn't have to be through the formal structure. How does it spread? As opposed to systematically via directives, this is critical. It spreads virally through stories and especially examples. When we talk about trust-based leadership, I don't think there's any area in business or in life really where role modeling is more important than when it comes to trust. To that earlier question, what if a leader behaves in non-trustworthy ways? Well, he's not going to influence too many people. They're going to have to do it on their own. But a person, certainly a leader, who behaves and who role models some of the principles and the virtues and the values of trust, that's very powerful. How's it get implemented? Through personal accountability, responsibility, and risk-taking, not through chain of command. You can't order people to be trustworthy or to trust others. You can persuade them, you can role model, and you can encourage people to take personal accountability. What motivates people? This is critical. It's not extrinsic incentives. It's really aspirational. It's getting people to recognize that their lives are richer, their clients' lives are richer, everybody's lives are richer. I go back to the beginning. We all kind of buy trust is a good thing. And we don't do it just because we're going to get higher bonuses or the company's going to make more money. In fact, that would counteract the belief in the generosity component of trust. And finally, how does it get measured? Instead of quantitative, because that's associated strictly with behaviors, there's a qualitative approach to measurement and an application of wisdom. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So headline, there's a different approach. If you want to build trust in an organization, don't do it the way that you would implement a new CRM system or a supply chain initiative. It's going to have to take into account that trust is a little bit different. So how do you scale it? Well, here's all the usual ways: competency models, metrics, incentives, compliance tools. That really doesn't work with trust. So I'd advise, if you're serious about trying to create trust in your team, don't look to these tools. Instead, look to these kinds of tools, 5 particular ones: diagnosis and commitment, leading by example, shared vocabulary, storytelling and dialogue, and managing by wisdom, not metrics, through use of these virtues and values. Let me dive into 3 of these. Actually, all 5, but I'm going to lump a few together.
Hey, Charlie, before you jump ahead, does anybody have any questions? And if you do have questions, there's a chat box. You can get to it by the bottom of your navigation or wherever your navigation is. Feel free to type them in. So there's no current questions loaded, but I just wanted to give people the opportunity.
Yeah, good. Otherwise, I'll let you
keep it. Go for it.
Okay. I want to offer you some tools for thinking about diagnosis. Everybody wants to know sort of how we're doing. Well, fair question. Now let's look at a diagnosis model for both values and for virtues. Let me start off with the values one. If you were to take and design a diagnostic instrument, which we've done, we call it the Trust Audit, the row or the column headers across the top here, those are the 4 trust values, trust principles: client focus, collaboration, long-term relational focus, and transparency. Now down on the left side, the row headers are, pick your own organizational model. This is a fairly generic one: external relationships, leadership, structure, rewards, etc. If you were to organize a questionnaire, there are 20 boxes there that you could fill in for a questionnaire. You could poll employees, you could poll customers, you could poll leadership, you could fill it out yourself. The idea is to get an assessment tool that maps these trust principles factors against some kind of organizational model. And again, if you were to do that, you could produce some interesting results like this, for example. You could say, well, where are we really strong and where are we really weak? And how does that manifest itself? So for example, in this made-up example, the weakest intersection point, which shows up in collaborative leadership. Well, I'd suggest to you one of the things that suggests is probably low innovation. Collaboration has been shown pretty well to help encourage, enhance innovation. So if that's missing, that's one possible outcome. What does low customer loyalty look like in a trust audit? Well, it probably looks like low scores on long-term focus on external relationships and low scores on client focus. So again, this is a schematic. We've actually built this. If anybody's interested, talk to us, but you can build your own. Use those values and map them against your favorite model of choice for organization design. So there's a thought about diagnosing what I call values. Let's look at virtues. And here, again, some of you know this, the trust equation, we've converted that into a diagnostic we call the TQ, the trust quotient. And if you, I'll show you in a minute how you can take this for free if you want. There are 20 questions. It takes about 3 to 4 minutes online. The interface looks like this. You get outputs like this. On the left-hand side, it gives you a score, describes what that score is, tells you your high and your low scores. And I think the one on the right here, if I recall, you actually have to pay us a little bit more money to get this kind of detail, but it's interesting detail too. You can all take the free version of that diagnostic for yourself. That's our front page website, and you'll see up at the top right. I'm not trying to advertise here. I'm just trying to say, here's a free tool if you're interested in pursuing what a diagnostic for virtues looks like. Okay, enough on diagnosis. Let me lump these next 3 together because I think they all have one thing in common. How do you scale trust? Lead by example, share vocabulary, storytelling, dialogue. All of these have to do with the basic insight that you get to trustworthiness and trusting behavior, not by metrics, not by goals and so forth. You get it by talking. And that's because trust is personal. Every interaction is unique. It's as much art as science. You can't possibly map all the possible ways that trust is increased. It's too complex for rule sets. Here's a little schematic I did just the other day. 7 or 8 of the key concepts that we talk about, every single one of them is related to another. You can't build a set of behaviors and checkbox rules for compliance on something this complicated. Everything is connected to everything else. So how do you do it? You best do it discursively. You talk about it. You communicate. You share stories. You take difficult examples and you get a few people together to talk about them. It really boils down to communication. One thing one of our clients has done, I'm terribly impressed with, they have built a very simple practice, a little bit of social engineering. They take small groups of people, they keep track of informally, a log on a common spreadsheet, some trust interactions they've had and how they worked, good or bad. And then periodically, every 5 or 6 weeks, they get together by phone for 40 minutes or so and say, how did this go? How did you handle that? How did this one work? Gee, what if you did it this way? In other words, they communicate about the application of the virtues and the values that we've talked about with respect to trust. So finally, the last part of scaling trust, how do you do it? You manage by wisdom, not metrics. You do it by applying these virtues and values systematically to every issue that presents itself. And trust, shows up in all kinds of aspects every day. In that same vein, let me give you a quick story. This is a picture of Bill Green, no relationship. Bill Green used to be the CEO at Accenture. And I remember I was giving a talk to some of the top leadership team at Accenture one day, and Bill Green preceded me on stage. So I was in the back of the room, and I got to observe a little bit. And he was announcing some fairly major form of reorganization within the firm at the time. And somebody asked a question of him, and they said, Bill, I like all this, but tell me, are the incentives lined up such that if I need to ask somebody in Hungary for support for me in Australia, they're incented to behave that way? And Bill Green got up out of his chair, visibly angry, and he said, listen, I understand the question, but I never want to hear that again. Let me be really clear. If there's ever a conflict between our principles and the right thing to do and our incentives, here's what you do. You do the right thing first, and you fix the incentives later. Now, right there, what Bill Green did, he role modeled, he articulated, he took a particular example, and he said, we're talking about applying principles. That's how we're going to run this business. Now, I'm not trying to flack for Accenture and say that they're a great trust-based firm or not. They do a lot of things fairly well. They do some things not so well. But that story, on that day, Bill Green made quite an impact. More so because he was the CEO, but I think other people could have made that point as well. So let me take a metaphor here, talk about storytelling. You all know the movie Fight Club, or you remember it or heard of it. This famous line, the first rule about Fight Club is you do not talk about Fight Club. That was also the second rule of Fight Club. You do not talk about Fight Club. Well, when it comes to the trust club, so to speak, you do talk about trust, and you talk about it all the time. That is how you scale it, through communications, not through metrics, not through behaviors. One last example. People often ask me a lot, well, who's somebody that does this really well? Here's a nice example. Up in Maine, Bangor Savings Bank. I've worked with them a few times over the years. And here's a couple of things that they say. The only reason we exist is that the people, businesses, and organizations in our markets have chosen to do business with us. We always repeat these simple messages about what's important in our meetings, in our conversations, in our relationships. All our decisions are anchored in these themes. The key to their success boils down to one thing: the consistent application of a core set of trust principles to all the bank's affairs. It's that simple and it's that complex. The way to create trust in an organization or a team, doesn't matter how big, is you talk about values and virtues, and you make sure that everybody always has them on mind. That's how you scale trust. Now, that's basically what I've got to say. Let me stop here and let's see. Again, this has been Creating the Trust-Based Organization. We're going to talk about more webinars later, but in the meantime, please rate this session. Jason, I think, is going to put a poll up in a moment. And yep, please, we got time now for some questions and answers. We got plenty of time, actually. So please, talk to us.
Give us some questions. There's a chat feature on the bottom. For me, it's on the bottom of my navigation. I think you can have your navigation oriented in different ways. We have a chat session where everybody can see the conversation. So if anybody has questions, now is the time. If it can be related to this topic or anything else around trust and the work that Charlie and Trusted Advisor Associates are working on. So does anybody have anything to say? Nothing yet.
Not all at once, people.
Somebody asked if we'll be sending the presentation earlier, and the answer is we're going to host the full webinar later so anybody can have access to this session. So we do have one question from Pilar. How do you explain this concept to a senior executive? I do not really have a trusted relationship with them yet. So go ahead.
Well, yeah, you're saying, Pilar, you're saying, how do I, Pilar, explain this to a senior executive? I think that's what your question means. I'm not sure. Buy them the book. Tell them to call me. Tell them to see this webinar. It's difficult to get people to change a point of view simply, and it's particularly difficult in a hierarchical relationship. If you're skeptical about your boss's receptivity to this, that's not easy to change people's minds. It's a fairly fundamental thing. But I guess you do it correctly.
The additional context is that nobody trusts this guy.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah.
Well, if you say nobody trusts this guy, then everybody else knows also that nobody trusts this guy. Very possibly that guy is not long for this organization. And B, if nobody trusts him, why are you trying to convince him? Sounds like everybody's going to develop a workaround. People don't work with people that they don't trust, that are untrustworthy. So my guess is your organization has already figured out ways to, for the water to flow around the rock. And I'm not sure there's a lot of percentage in trying to convince the rock that they ought to be trustworthy.
Well, here's another related question. How do you manage people who just don't get this? So I guess, it's a little bit different. It sounds like you're in more of a power of authority. We have a lot of questions coming in, so feel free to keep it. Yeah.
Good. Well, let's see. If there are people who do not report to you, if they're lateral, or non-hierarchical relationships, all the stuff that we talk about in these webinars, books, materials, etc., basically says you influence people by listening to them. You can make them trust you by being fabulous at listening to others, empathizing with them. It's hard to get people to become more trustworthy through a frontal assault by telling them how untrustworthy they are or what they ought to do. Nobody likes to be told what they ought to do. So I think you influence through role modeling the values and the virtues of trust, as we've talked about, as an individual. And I'll make a rough assumption, 90% of human beings are susceptible to, being treated well, they respond well. I will not argue that there's some category of people, maybe as high as 10%, who are essentially sociopaths and who don't respond to that. But for the most part, the way you make people trustworthy is you trust them and you behave towards them in trustworthy manners. And they tend to reciprocate.
Someone asked, the trust principles can be, or I guess there's different trust principles as well. Can you mention a few of the other ones than the ones you presented?
No, those are the four that we talk about. I was saying there's nothing magic about that four. Anybody else could come up with another list. It might include things like integrity. These are simply four principles that we have found to be internally coherent, consistent. But I don't mean to claim we have the world's greatest model and there's nothing else.
Let's see. I've noticed the topics that you discuss are the most challenging for most of my clients as an independent management consultant. How would someone learn to work in the field that you work in, or at least make these themes part of their practice? So basically, he's looking for resources. We have plenty of resources. If you want to guide them on that path.
Yeah, again, just to quickly headline it, you make people trust you as a consultant, as an independent consultant, which many of us are in this call, by behaving towards them in trusting and trustworthy ways. Now, Jason's right. On the website, we have got tons of material, about 100 articles, about 1,000 blog posts, a dozen ebooks, a bunch of little video clips. I think we're probably the most content-rich website of anybody in the quote trust business here. So I urge you to go in and dig around. And if you'd like more of a guided tour, drop me an email with a little more specifics, what you're looking for. I'd be happy to point you to some of that. It's all free.
Here's an interesting question. What business triggers exist that you've seen that indicate the trust virtues there's a cultural shift needed in terms of any, I guess, from outside business triggers?
How do you tell if it's an untrust? Well, I guess that question's saying, what are some indicators of a low trust organization? You hear some of it in the language, skepticism about criticism, short-term focus, excessive reliance on legal contracts, non-compete clauses, hiring terms that, non-compete, like I said, excessive reliance on compliance, cynicism, skepticism. Those I think are kind of generic, but those are you can pick those up when you hear about an organization, when you read what they write, when you listen to them talk.
Here's a common question that you get. Any suggestions for building trust in a short period of time, for example, during the sales process?
Absolutely. I'll put a shameless plug. Buy the book, Trust-Based Selling, because you should create trust immediately in the sales process with your first interaction. It's not something that you wait around to earn the right to. And the best form of selling comes by creating trust initially. You do it by being extremely truthful. You do it by focusing on listening to the other party, and paradoxically, remember the 3 Ps of trust: personal, paradoxical, and positively correlated to risk. You do it by being not wedded to getting the sale. In other words, you focus on the client in the sales process from the beginning without trying to make a sale. And if that sounds bizarre, think about it. If you encountered a salesperson who is really focused on your needs, who's not wedded to getting the sale, who's not wedded to their time frame, but focused on yours, who is willing to even refer you to a competitor if that's the right thing to do, guess who you're going to buy from? That person. Those are the kind of people that we like to buy from. So there's a real paradox right at the heart of selling. If you're willing to forego the chance of getting the sale, you actually increase the chances of getting the sale. The trick is you actually have to be willing to do it. So again, buy the book, Trust-Based Selling, or just go on the website and read lots of subject matter related to it for free. It'll save you the cost of the book.
Here's one that looks like I skipped over. Could a boss be interested in changing if they understood that they weren't the leader that they think they were? Example, a 360 review.
Yes, yeah. I think 360s in particular are helpful. They're a real dose of cold water in the face of people. I have seen cases where people, it forces you, particularly if you set up a 360 review in a way that the participant has a say in who's invited, and it's done well, that if you get feedback that is counter to what you thought about yourself, it's hard to deny that. So a well-done 360 is a great way to do that. Short of that, you're talking about the dynamics of interventions. You know, how do you get people to pay attention to criticism? It's not easy. You do it with care and focus on the other person and empathy for understanding where they're coming from. But hey, the 360 idea is a great one. By the way, we do offer, related to the trust equation, we do ourselves offer a 360 version of it for any of you interested.
Can you provide an example of the trust story? What elements need to be included in the story for it to have maximum impact?
Well, the nice thing about stories, it's a funny thing. All human beings, we're all kind of teenagers. None of us like to be told what to do. But the funny thing about stories, by telling an allegory, even if the point of the story is transparent, obvious, blatant, in your face, somehow it becomes depersonalized. And we get wrapped up in the story, and we have no trouble saying, oh yes, I identify with that, or that's a good point. And so suddenly all the antagonism about being told what to do goes away with a story. The point of the story can be anything related to trust. It can be, one of my favorite stories is my boss willing to say he didn't know the answer to a question. And I thought, what do you mean? You say you don't know? Yeah, you say you don't know. So there's a story about credibility. You can have stories about any of the 4 trust virtues, any of the 4 trust values. There's a lot of rich material in trust. If you remember that circle diagram I have with all the arrows, those are about a dozen different points related to aspects of trust, and you could come up with stories on every single one.
There's one. Someone's asking if there's a German network that also deals with these concepts that this person can be referred to.
A German network. I don't know anything about a German network.
We have some counterparts in Europe. Maybe they could reach out.
Yes, we do. We have several associates in Europe. If that's useful, send me an email. We'll chat about it.
Yeah, so just email charles@trustedadvisor.com.
No. C Green @trustedadvisor.com.
Sorry. Why don't you repeat it, Charlie? It's on the screen, right?
There we go.
There we go. Yep.
Green @trustedadvisor.com.
I think that might be it. Let's see. Andrew's just got some comments. I think that's it. Are there any other questions that I missed? Because there's a lot coming at once, so I was trying to keep up. Great. Well, we really appreciate everybody who attended. This has been a great session. Looks like we got some good feedback on the poll, so thanks for everybody who filled that out. We actually have 2 more webinars lined up. If you go to trustedadvisor.com/webinars, the next one is about overcoming some fears around networking. And then we have another one in May. And forgive me, I forgot the subject.
Why closing is hazardous to your sales health.
Exactly. That is it. So thank you for everybody who attended. And
thanks, everyone.
If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be happy to help you out. Take care,
everyone. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.